Once we've established our prima facie case for discrimination, our employer has to articulate a valid, non-discriminatory reason for what they did. They don't have to prove it, they just have to articulate it. So it's not surprising that employers come back with all kinds of reasons besides the discrimination to explain what they did to us. Once they've articulated their reasons, we have to come back with enough evidence to raise doubt about their explanation. And if we do a good enough job, EEOC will decide that the reasons they gave are not really the reasons they did what they did. It was just a cover for their discriminatory intent. Today I'm going to go through just a few quick examples of the kinds of pretexts that NASA used and how I fought back against it. And from there I want to go into some other stories that employers commonly tell and point you to some cases where you can read up on how to defeat those too. But before we get into those examples, I want to take just a minute to appreciate how hard it can be to hear your employer rationalize harming you. To me, NASA's pretext felt like they were blaming me for my boss's illegal behavior, and that hurt. Nobody likes hearing their boss say they're a screw-up, and it gets even harder when you're at EEOC and what your employer is saying isn't true. Sometimes NASA's pretext felt almost as cruel as the discrimination itself. Another hard thing about pretext is that it starts very early in the EEOC process, and it doesn't really go away until your case is decided once and for all. NASA would spin its pretext, I'd rebut it, and at the next stage of the process, NASA would spin the same pretext again, maybe with a little different twist, and I'd have to rebut it all over again. And that went on at every stage of the process. Sometimes the futility of having those same old arguments over and over and over again really got to me and left me feeling emotionally drained. NASA's pretext started on day one, when my boss told me that she didn't want to reasonably accommodate me because it wouldn't be fair to her non-disabled employees. I knew it was BS at the time, and frankly I had a hard time believing that she'd even say it. Especially since in my case, I already had the things that I was asking to use as reasonable accommodation, a flexible schedule, and an agreement to occasionally telework. All I was asking for was to be able to use those things to deal with medical emergencies related to my disability. But when I told my boss those things, she didn't back off. She just started making up other reasons not to reasonably accommodate me. She claimed that I was AWOL, frequently. She claimed that my job couldn't be done via telework, and she claimed that my performance had been slipping, so I wasn't a good candidate for telework anyway. I heard those excuses and a few others pretty much throughout my EEOC process. Most of NASA's pretext was fairly easy to rebut, and I want to give you a quick rundown of how I fought the three that I just mentioned. I was AWOL. It wasn't mentioned in any of my performance appraisals, and it wasn't documented anywhere else either. I'd never been disciplined for it or for anything else. Because of a performance award she had given me just 2 months earlier, I had an official certification signed by her that certified I didn't have any attendance problems. And the first time she ever mentioned her concerns was in response to my request for reasonable accommodation. My job couldn't be done via telework. I already had an approved episodic telework agreement signed by her that had been in place for years, and I was already teleworking under that agreement without any incidents. All my peers were under the same schedule and telework agreement, and they were allowed to use them for personal emergencies. And my performance was slipping? My performance appraisals didn't indicate that, and my awards didn't either. And I'd never missed a deadline or delivered a subpar work product. Those kinds of pretexts are extremely common, and the way that I handled them should give you some idea of how you can go about fighting them. There are a few other kinds of pretexts that I wanted to talk about too. And for each one, I'm going to point out some cases that you might want to check out if you're dealing with that kind of pretext. I'm not going to go through each one of those cases in detail, but I am going to put links to all of them in the description so you can read them for yourself. Type 1. Inconsistent reasons. Sometimes my boss justified not letting me telework by claiming that I was AWOL or my work was subpar or whatever. And sometimes she claimed that she was already letting me telework as a reasonable accommodation. It was pretty easy to show that at least one of those things wasn't true. And here are some other cases where inconsistent reasons like that helped expose employer pretext. Type 2. Delayed judgment. In NASA's motion for summary judgment, they claim that I had communication problems so bad that my boss couldn't discuss reasonable accommodation with me. They offered up one example from years earlier and used that to paint a picture of a long-standing pattern. My communication problem never existed until my boss needed to use it to rationalize her behavior. And here are some other cases involving delayed judgment that you might want to check out. Type 3. Designing failure. Our diversity manager tried to put me on a PIP that said if I missed work one time without my boss's prior approval, even if I was sick, that I'd be fired. There was so much wrong with what NASA was trying to do that I was able to keep them from putting me on a PIP, so they weren't able to design my failure. But they tried. Here's another case where designing failure was used as pretext. Type 4, deviations from policy. When employers violate their own written policies, it raises questions about why at EEOC. At one point, my boss tried claiming that I had never requested reasonable accommodation because I didn't use those exact words in my request. She claimed that NASA policy said that I had to. Fortunately for me, NASA's policy said the exact opposite. And here are some other cases where deviations from policy expose pretext. Type 5, failure to document. My boss claimed that I was AWOL frequently, but she had never documented a single instance. And her failure to document a serious concern like that sort of made it look like it wasn't a real concern. And here are some other cases that you might want to check out for failure to document. Type 6, undocumented performance issues. Sometimes my boss claimed that I wasn't capable of doing my job with or without reasonable accommodation, but my performance record said otherwise. And here are some other cases where similar things happened. Now these 6 are not all the types of pretexts that your employer may come up with, but they should give you a really good idea of what to expect and some idea of how to fight back. It's not fair that employers get to make up stories about us and keep repeating them over and over, even after we've disproven them, but the process encourages it. Eventually, I did get some vindication for NASA's pretext when EEOC's Office of Federal Operations denied NASA's request for appeal, upheld my entire judgment, and spelled out all the reasons that they didn't believe NASA's pretext. That felt great, and when NASA deposited a big wad of money into my bank account, that felt even better. So when your employer busts out the pretext, don't even think about quitting. Hang in, because winning is the best revenge.